Alrighty. So we've gone through a number of sections, actually, just like 3 or 4 major sections last semester. So this semester, we're going to start off with a few quick sections, and hopefully they won't take all that long. They're relatively simple. They're aviation related, obviously, but less flying, and this is more like uh, just general safety knowledge. So. Um, Yeah, let's get started with aeronautical decision making. So, what is ADM? Basically, it's just good pilot judgment. Not much to it. Basically, just making the right decision, managing your surroundings properly, making sure you have uh, plans in place in case stuff goes wrong. Um, Make sure you avoid accidents, incidents, that kind of stuff. It's about mitigating risk when it comes down to it, and dealing with stuff when it does come up. As we can see here by this little picture, uh, most of the general aviation accidents happen during takeoff and landing. A number also happen during cruise and maneuvering, but abnormal percentage happen during takeoff and landing. And so applying ADM and some other techniques, which we'll talk about during especially those phases of flight, but all phases of flight, will help reduce the chance that you get into a hazardous situation. So risk management. This is definitely a big part of ADM. And if you follow it, hopefully you can eliminate the risk fully, if not mostly. The little image here on the right is like a kind of a step through of what you could do, and we have some acronyms later to help us with this, but it kind of shows you the risk management process. You identify a hazard, assess risk, you go through, and then you eventually mitigate that risk, and then check to make sure that it stays mitigated. There's 4 kind of major fundamental principles when it comes to risk management. One is you accept no unnecessary risk. So whatever it may be, whatever the situation is, if you don't have to take that risk, like let's say, I don't know, it's a weird runway situation, you can only take off in one direction. I do know of an airport like this, and let's say you have a pretty strong tailwind. Well, what's the risk? You could go off the end of the runway before you could take off, or maybe you're landing on that runway or whatever. Is that a risk you have to take? Well, maybe not. It depends on your situation, your scenario, what's going on. But when it comes down to it, you should make that decision. That kind of brings to the second principle. You should make the decision at the appropriate level. So you are the PIC, most likely, of the aircraft. So you make the command, or you make the decisions for that plane. It's not the FAA, it's not ATC, it's not your instructor who makes these decisions. It's you as the PIC who should make the decisions for the aircraft. And so you have to make sure that the right people are making that decision for what's going to happen. You should also accept risk when benefits are greater than inherent danger. So let's say, I don't know, there's a storm, okay, so a thunderstorm, that you have to fly through, but I don't know, for some reason there's a hurricane behind you that's catching up to you. So either you turn around and fly into the hurricane, or you fly through this little minor thunderstorm. Now, you shouldn't fly through a thunderstorm, but I guarantee you flying through a thunderstorm probably better than flying through a hurricane. Maybe, I don't know, depends on the strength of the hurricane. Just an outlandish example, but if a risk is greater than the danger, you should always take it. At least as long as you perceive that it's greater. Obviously, you can't measure it fully until you take that. But so fourth principle is going to be integrating risk management into all levels of planning. And that's something we're going to talk about throughout the rest of these slides. So CRM and SRM. These are 2 acronyms that get thrown around a lot in talking about aeronautical decision making. So crew resource management and single pilot resource management. So what is crew resource management? Well, it's the process of managing a team on board an aircraft in order to mitigate or counter risks. So let's say, you have a pilot, a co-pilot. Sometimes they used to have, extra flight engineers, flight officers, whatever, even and nowadays you have your team of flight attendants also are included in this. So, you have this group of people who are on board the aircraft, and their job is to help whoever is in charge manage risk. So the pilot makes sure that the pilot in command, I should say, makes all the decisions. So they're going to make the final say, but they can delegate tasks. They can make sure that they get information for the necessary places and get current up-to-date information. So information from the flight attendants, from the engine monitoring officers, so the flight engineer, whatever that might be. And this is process that is learned and is kind of perfected in the corporate world, but most often private pilots will not fly with a flight crew. So there is something called single pilot resource management, and that's what we're going to focus on. So it's a lot like crew resource management, except you are the only one that is doing all this stuff. So there are a lot of things that are included in this. So ADM is a broad term, is included in single pilot resource management, risk management, task management, automation management, so managing your autopilot and other stuff, CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain, and situational awareness, all kind of follow under this SRM category. So we're going to talk about the 5 hazardous attitudes, and these relate back to SRM in kind of a psychological way. So this is more about making sure that you are safe to fly and making sure that you reflectively assess your own risk and what risk you pose to the aircraft by making decisions. So the first hazardous attitude that we're going to talk about is anti-authority. So this is the don't tell me attitude. This is when someone really doesn't like someone, maybe it's someone in the right seat or someone in the back, or maybe even somebody on the ground telling that pilot what to do. And they really don't appreciate this. They also usually don't like to follow the rules. They don't think the rules would apply to them for whatever reason. And so to each of these attitudes, we're going to have an antidote. And for the FAA exam, you'll probably have to know usually you'll either have to know the antidote or the actual name of the hazardous attitude. So I highlighted these in yellow. So the antidote for anti-authority is follow the rules. They're usually right. And this works just based on the virtue that the rules are in place because something happened. Rules don't just get made in aviation to get made. Something had to happen in order for it to come about. So to combat this anti-authority attitude that the rules don't apply, you have to think the rules are there for a reason. We should follow the rules. They're usually right. Next one is impulsivity, the do it quickly attitude. Usually you feel the need to do something, just do it. It's not anything in particular, just something. You don't usually think about what you're doing, and you just do the first thing that comes to your mind. An antidote for this is not so fast, think first. So slow it down, weigh all of your options, and then choose that action, and don't just do the thing that comes to your mind because it could make the situation much worse for you. Invulnerability, the it won't happen to me attitude. Accidents only happen to others. It's kind of the phrase that you might hear with this. I will never be in an accident, even though it happens to others. Usually accidents in aviation are rare. Aviation is the safest mode of transportation. So this is a very valid thought. However, accidents do happen, and usually they happen when you least expect them. So putting the notion in a way that they won't happen to you is just, it's crazy. So the antidote for this is it could happen to me. The macho attitude, the I can do it attitude. This person always tries to prove that they're better than everyone else, and they take risks to impress others. So, whatever this might mean for that person, whether it's, flying in really tight formation or really close to the ground, or, flying really close to buildings, or, I don't know, doing something crazy in an aircraft that's not designed to do something, just because they want to show everybody that they can do it. obviously this doesn't make any sense, and you will easily damage yourself or the aircraft. And so the antidote for this is taking chances is foolish. And the final hazardous attitude is resignation. What's the use? This is usually a person who don't think they have a say in what's going to happen next. They hope everything just goes well, and it, just good luck when it goes well. And when they go bad, it's just not in their power to change anything. It's just up to kind of the forces of the universe, and leaving things to others, maybe under the facade of being a nice guy. So usually when you encounter this, it's just going to be someone that's just given up on any possibility of getting out of the situation. They just feel like they've done everything and that nothing's working. And the antidote for this is, I'm not helpless, I can make a difference. And so you have to remember that you're the pilot in command, and so you should be doing everything you can, and you can do stuff to get out of the situation. You should fly the airplane. This is kind of an antidote to the story. So even when you're flying an airplane that's going to crash, say you have an engine out, if you fly into, say, trees, let's say there's nothing else around, you'd have to land in trees. You should keep flying that airplane until it stops, because if you don't fly the airplane and you stall over trees, or you crash land into trees instead of landing, smoothly, as smooth as you can into trees, that is, you're much less likely to survive if you fly the airplane controlled into the trees. So flying the airplane until it stops is one of these things that you always do, whether it's on a runway or out in the middle of nowhere, because you have a much more likely chance of surviving that compared to just giving up. All right, now we're going to talk about assessing risk. So the easiest way to assess risk is to use something like this risk assessment matrix. So on one side, you have the likelihood of the thing occurring, and then on the top, you have the severity if it occurs. And so you kind of have this grid, and using this, you can kind of estimate what the risk impact would be. So for instance, if the likelihood is, semi-probable, it could happen, it might be occasional, and the severity might be negligible. So I don't know, let's say your navigation lights go out. So it could happen, maybe it's been a year or several years since you've replaced them, and they're likely to go out soon. It's probable to happen, but maybe not much will happen because of that. The airplane's not going to crash. So that might be in the low risk category. Maybe as a counterexample to that, let's say that you have had a history of engine out failures. Your engine's been acting up lately. It's been acting up. You haven't taken it to the mechanic. It's a probable likelihood that your engine's going to fail. This is a very bad thing. So maybe it's critical or even catastrophic. And so, using that risk assessment tool, you can kind of gauge whether or not you should go flying. If your engine's going to fail, you probably shouldn't. So how do we mitigate risk in some scenarios here? So let's say you have a passenger who gets motion sick, but you'd still like to take them flying. It's a pretty benign example, but lots of people get motion sick, especially if they're flying in the back seat. What are some things that you could do to mitigate this risk? Well, you can have some sick bags handy. It's always helpful, and making sure that the passenger knows where they're at in case they need them. Just makes things go very smooth, and it helps mitigate the task when the time comes for the pilot to intervene in that situation if the passenger already knows where they're at. You can have them take some medicine. There's several medications available for motion sickness, and so maybe that's another way to mitigate risk. You could have them sit up front in one of the front seats of the aircraft. A lot of times that'll help. Even I get a little bit motion sick in the back seat just because of how the center of gravity and the center of lift are situated in little planes like that. You could try and reduce maneuvering. Don't take them out and do steep turns for 30 minutes or something like that. Keep them to a minimum. And if it's a bumpy day, maybe you just wait for a better day to take them flying. So that's just a way you can mitigate risk in that scenario. So here's a checklist. You'll see this come up all the time. And it's a way to help mitigate your own risk. Again, like the 5 hazardous attitudes, this is just something that you can use to check yourself and make sure you're good to fly. So it's called the IMSAFE checklist. So illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion. And you can go through this checklist and you can check to see if you have any of these things that might make you or pose a potential risk to your flight. So illness, asking yourself if you're sick. Some sicknesses might not be a problem, but something like a sinus infection could be a big problem, especially with big pressure changes. You could blow your sinuses out or something bad. And you wouldn't want that while you're flying. Medication. There are a lot of medications that are bad to fly on. You don't want to fly on anything that's going to make you, drowsy or unable to think properly. And not all of these are listed. The FAA does have a small list, but you should really consult a medical professional before you fly on a certain medication. And especially if a medication doesn't work well with you, you should make sure that you do not fly on that. Stress. So is anything going on in your life that you shouldn't be flying? Any type of stress really that is causing you any problems, you should definitely think about that before you go flying. And stress, you might alleviate your stress by going flying, but you should still take that into consideration. That has a pretty big impact on your ability to think properly. All right, alcohol. There's a general rule in aviation. I think we talked about this when we went through the FARs. You can not fly on a blood alcohol content of more than 0.04. So the general rule in aviation is 8 to 10 hours bottle to throttle. So making sure that you don't have any alcohol in your system while you're flying. The FAA says 8 to 24 hours because alcohol does affect people differently. So fatigue. Are you tired? Have you had enough rest? Maybe you just got off a 12-hour shift or something. Maybe you should consider taking some sleep before you go up and fly. And it could be a scenario where you're doing a long cross country. You've been flying for 6 hours or something like that. Maybe you should stop at an airport and get a hotel or something and just sleep for a little bit before you go flying, because fatigue could creep up on you and just get you at the time you least expect it. So make sure you're definitely well rested prior to flight. And lastly, emotion. So again, this kind of goes with stress, but it's a different kind of thing, I guess. So is there anything emotional going on in your life that would cause problems when you're flying, whatever that might be? So IMSAFE checklist. It's a great tool to mitigate your risk when you're flying. All right, we're going to talk about another checklist. This one is more encompassing than just yourself. The IMSAFE checklist will come up again, but this encompasses some other things as well. So this is called the PAVE checklist. So you have pilot, aircraft, environment. Why they did that, I don't know. And external pressures. So PAVE. So pilot and command. You can use the IMSAFE checklist for this. Again, there it is. And just making sure that you're safe to fly. 5 hazardous attitudes, the IMSAFE. And eventually we'll talk about what a personal minimums checklist is. You can include that in here as well. So just going through, making sure everything checks out, make sure that there's nothing abnormal. The aircraft. So this is, like we talked about in the FAR aim, this is something like checking the if you have the right stuff to fly, the aircraft equipment. So FAR 91205, the A tomato flames, making sure that you have all that stuff, making sure that you yourself are current with that aircraft. Maybe you're used to flying like Cessnas or something, and this is a high performance VTOL Bonanza. Maybe it might be a good idea to get checked out in that aircraft before you go fly. Could be something like making sure it could carry the useful load that you're planning on taking. So maybe you have 4 passengers and baggage and full tanks of gas. Maybe you should check whether or not that aircraft can actually take all that weight. There's a few other things on this list as well. Just going through, making sure that you know that your aircraft is capable of making the trip with its instruments, its fuel, its weight and balance, and making sure that you are able to fly that airplane as well. Environment. So mostly when we talk about environment, we're going to be talking about weather, but it also does include things like terrain, but for the most part, weather. So things like ceilings, visibility, how weather may change during your flight. Maybe there's a front moving in, so you might have to take that into consideration. What are the winds like? Is it going to be a heavy crosswind? What are the winds aloft like? Is it going to be a pretty stiff breeze going there, or you need more gas coming back if there's a strong headwind? Thunderstorms, icing, nighttime. Those are all things you can consider with weather, and making sure that you mitigate that risk. Maybe you don't go flying when it's forecasted for a thunderstorm or a strong cold front moving through, or low visibility or something like that. The other thing that's included in this is terrain. So we didn't really talk about what these are, but on a sectional chart, each section between lines of latitude and longitude has what's called a minimum elevation figure. So these are a number that's assigned to that section. And basically, if you fly above that altitude, you'll be clear of any obstacles and terrain. So over water, they won't even mention it because it's like 0. But over mountainous terrain, it might be something like 3,000 or 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet. As long as you stay above them, you'll be fine. So knowing your minimum elevation figures and knowing your minimum safe altitude that you can be at is part of this V. Also, we'll talk about things like airports. So making sure you check all the NOTAMs, making sure you check lighting availability, maybe alternate airports along your route. What kind of glide slope does it have? Does it have a PAPI or a VASI? Maybe it has an ILS indicator. What if your engine fails on your planned route? What do you do? So considering all of your destinations, what do they have? Checking the chart supplements and the airport information to make sure that you know what you're getting into before you go there, especially if it's an airport you're unfamiliar with. And finally, we'll talk about airspace here. So, is it a special use airspace like a military operating area, or a restricted airspace like a TFR? Making sure you know where those are at on your route. Maybe where you're flying is like mountainous terrain. So if you had to make a crash landing, it might not be the easiest place to get in and out of. So maybe you take some survival gear with you when you're flying over that type of terrain. Those kinds of things. And finally, external pressures. So maybe you feel like, there's some pressure to get somewhere. We call these the itises. So the get home itis, the get there itis, and the let's go itis. So maybe, I don't know, it's something important like a wedding, and you really can't wait for weather. And so you risk it with the weather, but that turns out to be a bad risk. You should always try and wait stuff out, even if it's something big. People are probably going to understand that you didn't go flying through a thunderstorm just to get somewhere on time. So find another way to get there. Maybe you drive instead of fly. If things aren't looking good a few days ahead, maybe you just ditch the flight entirely, or maybe choose a different route. Whatever that might be. So mitigating risk through these sorts of things, making sure that you're not swayed by any passengers that might be in the aircraft that you're trying to, show off for. You take your buddy up flying and you want to show them what your airplane can do. Maybe that's not the best idea. And there's always other external pressures that come up, but this is kind of a short list. So yeah, mitigating those risks, making sure you have extra time, make sure you have alternates, and make sure you don't have a lot of pressure to make it to the destination on a certain time schedule. You don't push things back right to the deadline. Make sure you have extra time. All right. So now that we've covered kind of the risk management, figuring out risk, identifying risk, now we're going to talk about how to mitigate risk. So before I go on, is there any questions about finding risk or any of the stuff we've covered so far?
For the PAVE system, that
Yes.
is that something we're going to see on the test exactly?
Maybe. Most of the time when you see this, it's going to be during your oral exam, during your check ride, and they'll ask you how you mitigate risks, and you'll have to come up with a checklist or some way to show that you can mitigate all the risks. So it's unlikely you'd see it on something like the FAA written exam, but
Okay.
it might come up. But really what it is they're probably going to ask you questions about what you should do. So let's say identify hazard attitude, or ask you a question about FAR 91205, weather, something like that. They'll ask you to make a decision. And so this is just a way to help you do that. But yeah, you probably won't get asked a specific question, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else?
What are these MEFs you're talking about?
The what?
The minimum elevations.
Oh, yeah, here, 1 second.
I see a lot of numbers on the sectional chart, but none of them look like minimum elevations.
Yeah, kind of hard to see. Let me pull up Sky Vector here. All right, so if you have the sectional chart, inside a box, so you have your latitude here, or your lat longe box here. So you have this box that's enclosed, and inside each of these boxes, there's going to be a set of blue numbers. Unless it's 0, then they won't have anything. And these blue numbers, in this case, it says 20. That's your minimum elevation figure for this box. So inside here, if you fly above 2,000 feet, you know that you'll avoid any towers, any terrain, anything like that.
Okay, so there aren't any of those over water, which is why I did not see anything in Superior.
Right, yes. Unless there's something out there, they won't say anything. So yeah,
mostly it's standard rock, 1,000 feet.
Yeah, some of them have them, but yeah, for the most part, if it's over water, it'll just have nothing. But yeah, so that's what those are. All right, we'll pull this back up. All right, anything else? Cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about the decision-making process. So how we go through and mitigate risk. So we're going to talk about 3 different models: the 5P model, the 3P model, and the decide model. So first, let's talk about the 5P model. The plane, the pilot, the passengers, and the programming. I personally find this model quite arduous to remember, but whatever, here it is. So the plan. This involves the route, the mission planning route. So, whenever you're going. So you're going from here, Houghton County, to, I don't know, downstate Lansing. Whatever your route is, direct, or maybe you go over by Mackinac and then down, whatever that is. Make sure that you know everything about your route. because things can always change. And so, making sure that, your weather, ATC might vector you somewhere else that you weren't expecting. Making sure you know where the TFRs are, and you make sure that you avoid those unless for some reason you're involved in them. And especially on longer flights, again, the weather can change quite drastically. And you might have to divert by the time you get somewhere. So making sure that you have a lot of alternates, making sure that you have everything along the route kind of planned out, and just general idea of things off of your route. So maybe it's looking 20, 30, 50 miles off of your route at other possibilities in case things come up. And making sure maybe some of your alternate airports, maybe they have a crew car that you can rent, or if they have an FBO, you can get gas there, stuff like that. And making sure that you're up to speed on all those things. The plane. So issues could arise during flight. Mechanical failures do happen. Making sure that you're aware of what to do when something happens. So maybe it's an alternator failure, or a magneto failure, or I don't know, you run out of gas, something like that. You have to know what the procedures are in order to mitigate that risk. So a lot of times there are checklists. So things like in-flight fires, engine outs, things like that we have checklists for. And so you just go through the checklist and you make sure that the risk is either mitigated or you're finding a solution to mitigate that risk. Especially with a lot of electronics now, our onboard aircraft, it can be easy to get overwhelmed. So making sure that you're familiar with the electronic flight display, if it has one. If you have an electronic flight bag with charts and stuff on an iPad, making sure you're familiar with that. If it has ForeFlight, making sure you're aware of that. Just making sure that you're familiar with new systems when they get implemented into your aircraft. The other thing is making sure that when you're flying to IFR, even low IFR conditions, you have a proper task management system. So IFR is, it's very disorienting if you're a VFR pilot. Obviously, if you're well trained, you can still get disoriented, but when you train for IFR, you train to trust your instruments. And that's really the big thing. So making sure that you're trained for that stuff. If it has a task management system like an autopilot, though, it might be helpful to have, especially for IFR flights. Alleviate some of the pressure to maintain constant altitude, make sure you maintain a constant attitude and stuff like that. So making sure you're familiar with how to operate that and how to implement that. The pilot. So like we mentioned before, the IMSAFE checklist could apply here. We talked about personal minimums, so making sure that you have a minimum for like crosswind components. So let's say the crosswind component of your aircraft is, the maximum is 15 knots. So a Cessna maximum you can do is 15 knots. That's the maximum demonstrated. So maybe you set yours at like 10 knots. Maybe that's a good personal minimums for you. And making sure you adhere to that so that you don't, exceed that and then get into a risky situation. Also understand things that you're less comfortable with. So maybe you're less comfortable with IFR. Maybe you're a VFR pilot and you've never done IFR. Making sure you avoid getting into that. Night flight. A lot of pilots do not like night flight, especially in a single engine aircraft. It's a lot harder to find somewhere to land at night if you have an engine out. And in general, night flying is just less fun if you're in a single engine airplane. So you're trying to avoid that. Maybe this also includes making sure that you have all of your available resources and you know what they are. So passengers are a good resource for certain things, not all things. ATC, great resource for traffic information, weather information, flight service station, in case you weather, flight plans, all that stuff. So making sure you know what's available to you and how to use it effectively. All right, the passengers. So Usually, if you're in a single engine airplane, you're going to be sitting right next to your passengers. This might not be the case, but usually it is. Usually passengers have less knowledge than you do about the airplane. And sometimes they may think they have more knowledge, but that's a different case. So making sure that you have limits on, times that they're talking. So maybe they don't talk during landing. Also making sure that they know not to touch things. I know it can seem obvious, but it might not to them. And making sure they know when to, again, maybe when ATC calls you up, they don't know to just stop talking. It's kind of innate knowledge once you start flying, but maybe they don't know that. So making sure they know that, making sure they also know emergency procedures for exiting the aircraft during emergencies and some other stuff like that. And so making sure that they're in the loop is a good way to mitigate that kind of risk. They're also a great resource for things like plane spotting. So, maybe you're flying along and you just have them look out the airplane and see if they spot any planes, because, another set of eyes never hurts to look for things like that. Again, making sure they're up to date on the risks involved, and make sure you give them things to keep them busy so that they're not pestering you or touching things or stuff like that. And yeah, I talked about the sterile cockpit stuff. So making sure they're not talking when they're not supposed to. And finally, the programming. So this has to deal with things like glass cockpits, autopilots, stuff like that. So making sure you're up to date on advanced avionics, GPS, making sure you know how to work everything that is in your airplane if you need it. And you don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to reprogram a GPS in flight. You should just know how to do it. It can cost a lot of time, a lot of gas, and it could put you in a risky situation if you lose track of where you are or your attitude in relation to the ground or something like that. So make sure you practice, make sure you know what you're doing with all your instruments. All right, the 3P model: the perceive, process, and perform. So first, the 3P model has, this is kind of bad, but the 3P model incorporates 3 other models inside of it. So the perceive has the PAVE model, which we talked about. The process has the care model, and the perform has the team model. A lot of models. So the 3P model is all about mitigating risk in flight. So you first perceive what's going on, then you process that information, and you make a plan about what to do, and then you act on that, and then you monitor what's going on and making sure that that risk was indeed mitigated. So first, perceive. So in order to perceive something, we'll use the PAVE model, for instance. So make sure that the pilot, the IMSAFE checklist, the aircraft, making sure that everything is nominal with the aircraft. So there's nothing wrong with any of the instruments, nothing wrong with the engine. Electronics look good, stuff like that. Monitoring the environment around you, make sure weather's staying the same, airports didn't close on you, you're not flying into a TFR or a military operating area. And then finally, you can check for external factors. So time, day, passengers, whatever that might be. So first you perceive using the PAVE model. So you identify the hazard, and then you can process that hazard. So you process the information using this care checklist. So consequences is the C. So how many people will it affect? What's the severity of whatever this thing is? So I don't know, let's take an engine out, for instance. So what are the consequences? Well, it could be you and whoever else is in the airplane. It could be people on the ground, especially if you're over like a large populated area. How bad is it? Well, pretty bad unless you can get the engine restarted. So, you're probably going to end up on the ground. And so, you take that into the back of your mind as you're figuring out what to do. So next thing is alternatives. Maybe it's, delay your flight if it's weather. Find an alternate if you're in the air. Maybe it's just don't fly at all. In our case of an engine out, your alternative is to either restart the engine or land. So make sure you have a place that maybe you can glide to. Maybe it's an airport that's close by. Maybe it's a field. Don't aim for buildings, stuff like that. And making sure that, you act in the best way possible. The R is reality. So maybe this isn't a good thing to coincide with our example, but what would happen if I didn't go? Maybe you don't go due to marginal weather, or maybe you do decide to go, and then you end up in upset spin where you crash. Making sure that you understand that reality does exist. In the case of an engine out, you're probably going to crash. You have control over what kind of crash that is, but you want to make sure that you understand that it's going to happen. You have to put the plane on the ground, and preferably you want to do it somewhere safe. And then finally, this external pressures comes up again. So make sure that nobody's really putting pressure on you for arrival or departure. You don't need to get the plane anywhere before weather hits. Make sure that passengers especially are not influencing your decision. So mitigating that external pressure for anything outside of the scope of anything else. So care, again, is consequences, alternatives, reality, and external pressures. A rule of thumb that the FAA has is if you say it'll probably be okay, then rethink the situation. So you can use that to process the information and figure out what to do. And then finally, we can use the team model to perform. Once we have figured out the risk and we've processed the risk, now we can perform on that risk. So team is going to be transfer. So should we transfer something to someone else? Should we eliminate the hazard? Is there a good way to eliminate the hazard? In the case of like an engine out, again, there's not really a good way to mitigate it or eliminate it. So, choose the best place to land would be the elimination of that. Accepting. So does accepting the risk outweigh the cost? In the case of an engine out, you kind of have to accept the risk at that point. Mitigate. So what can be done to mitigate the risk further? In the case of an engine out, you have a checklist. So the last thing on the checklist is making sure that your doors are open when you land. So in the case that your airplane lands pretty hard, it could happen that the doors jam shut and you can't get out. So one of the things we do just before we land is we pop the doors open to make sure that we can get out of the airplane. And that's something that you can do to mitigate the risk further. So using this team model, you can perform on the risks, you can transfer, eliminate, accept, or mitigate. And using this 3P model, you can hopefully mitigate or eliminate risk. Alrighty, the DECIDE model. So DECIDE is detect, estimate, choose, identify, do, evaluate. This is another model to help you identify, decide what to do, and then perform on that risk. So first, detect. Figuring out what the problem is. This is the first step. You have to figure out what the problem is before you can solve it. So here are some examples. So your aircraft starts pitching up violently. Could be out of control electronic trim wheel. It could be, I don't know, cable snapped and your elevator stuck up. Something like that. It's pretty obvious that something's going on. So it's easy to detect. Something that might not be so obvious is something like the gyro compass drifting. This happens. So it's, a gyroscopic instrument. So it's subject to gyroscopic precession. And so you might not notice it. It might be really slow, but it is a risk nonetheless. So detecting the risk is the first thing. Then you have to estimate the risk. So you have to figure out, what could happen, what would need to be done. and making sure that you don't overreact to a situation and make it worse. And also making sure that you don't fixate on a problem, because if you fixate, other things can happen in the aircraft and you can lose sight of that. So some examples might be the master caution light comes on, and you start to work on that, but then you fail to look up and manage the aircraft. So, you could fly it into the ground very easily by being distracted by this master caution light. That could be nothing. And, you crash the airplane. Another example could be that your engine starts to surge and your climb rate seems low. So you decide to make a landing in a farm field, this could be, you still had an engine. You need to make the landing. Maybe it was a good decision. You won't know until you figure out what's wrong with it. But, estimating what you need to do. It's not necessarily about actually doing it, but it's about figuring out what your options are. So first detect, then estimate. And that's really about figuring out what your options are. Choose. So this is the step where you choose to do something that will take you towards that solution. So in the case of an engine failure, you choose to land the plane. If a circuit breaker trips in the aircraft, make sure that you fly the plane. And so choosing that action will help mitigate any further risk in making sure that you have a solution to the problem that has arisen. So we have detect the problem, estimate what to do, what your options are, and then choose a solution that will help guide you to a solution. Then we can identify. Identifying is about the finding the solution. So a solution might be using what you've come up in the past 2 steps to solve the problem, or it might be something like a checklist. So I was referencing this earlier, but this is our emergency engine failure checklist. So we call it the ABC checklist. So airspeed, best field checklist for things that could possibly relate to an engine failure. So your fuel selector, make sure it's on both. It's not just in one tank or the other. Make sure your fuel shutoff is in, your mixture is rich. Make sure your circuit breakers are in, and make sure that your magnetos are on both. And then if none of those work, then you declare an emergency, and then you prep the doors for an exit. And so identifying is all about finding the solution to the problem. So the past 2 steps, you estimated what you could do. You chose a decision to get you towards a solution. So in the case of flying the plane or figuring out how to land, and then identifying is all about identifying a solution that might solve the problem and actually prepping for it. So in the case of engine failure, again, ABC checklist. So D is do. This is the step where you do the thing that you've decided to do in the past 3 steps. So you've detected, you've estimated what you could do, you've chosen an action, you have identified something to help with the problem, and then you do that thing. So complete the checklist, land the airplane, whatever it is that you've decided to do. And then the final letter is evaluate. So this is about making sure that you actually mitigated the risk and didn't make it worse. So if it is an engine out checklist, you make sure that your engine either comes back on or maybe it doesn't, and you have to prep for landing. In the case of like a circuit breaker, make sure when you push it back in, that doesn't pop back out, something like that. And if something comes back up, then you just repeat the process again, starting with the D. So you go through this, and then if it doesn't work, you go back and start again. So yeah, that's the decide model. Detect, evaluate, or not evaluate, detect, estimate, choose, identify, do, and evaluate. And that is how you can mitigate risk. Okay, that's a lot of acronyms. Yeah, again, you might be asked questions like, what does the D stand for in decide or something like that on a written, but I don't know. I don't remember seeing it, so might not, but this is more like stuff for your oral exam, so I wouldn't worry about it too much, but make sure that you know what's out there to help mitigate risk and make sure you're kind of familiar with what it is. So I should say, any questions on those models?
That's a lot of models.
Yeah, it's a lot. I know. But yeah, anyway. So now we're going to talk about just some extraneous things, and then we'll get into some physiology stuff. So here are some operational pitfalls. And this is a pretty comprehensive list of things that the FAA has identified as common problems that you might find yourself in a situation involving. So peer pressure, get there-itis, scud running when you're flying under clouds, low altitude, continuing VFR flight into instrument conditions, bad, operating without adequate fuel reserves. So these are just things to know, just kind of be aware of what is involved in each of these and how you might avoid them. All right. Here is a list of cockpit resources. So we talked about SRM several slides ago, and this is kind of in addition to that. What are some things that you have available to you to use in the cockpit? So you have internal resources like charts and handbooks, checklists, instruments, instructors, passengers. Those are all good things to use. And you have a lot of external resources as well. So ATCs out there, FSS, Flight Service Station, your aircraft maintainers, and even other aircraft. So if you're flying information and you want somebody to look at your aircraft from the outside, they might be able to help you with that. So there's a lot of resources available to you, making sure that you use them effectively to help mitigate your risk. All right. Now we're going to quickly, hopefully, go through this aviation physiology section. So aviation physiology, and this isn't the last time we'll talk about this either. This is just kind of a brief overview as it relates to risk. Has to deal with stuff like pressure effects, motion sickness, what happens to your body when you're flying, and what are some things to consider when you're flying. So first, we're going to talk about some pressure effects. So hypoxia. Hypoxia happens when the oxygen supply is very low, and this causes your brain to have this deficiency, and it can cause headaches, it can change skin color, rapid breathing, confusion, and eventually you'll just pass out. So low oxygen usually occurs at higher elevations, but could occur as low as 5,000 feet at night. So it's something to be aware of. FAA has regulations on this. So above 12,500 feet for more than 30 minutes, the crew has to have oxygen. At 14,000 feet above, all crew must have oxygen all the time. And above 15,000 feet, oxygen has to be offered to all passengers if it's a non-pressurized aircraft. So if it's a pressurized aircraft, none of this applies, but in a non-pressurized aircraft, you have to obey these regulations. So it's just something to be aware of if you start to feel lightheaded, you have confusion, stuff like that. Might be a safe bet to descend to a lower altitude or get oxygen. Scuba diving. This isn't something that you necessarily would think about, but it's a pretty big deal if you're into this stuff. So after you go scuba diving, your body needs a lot of time to release the excess nitrogen before you can safely ascend to flight altitudes. So the FAA has some recommendations about how long you should wait after you go diving. So if you're flying less than 8,000 feet, you should wait at least 12 hours if you did not require controlled descent, so pretty shallow diving. And if you did require controlled descent, probably deeper diving, you need to wait 24 hours before you fly at altitudes less than 8,000 feet. And if it's above 8,000 feet, just in general, you just wait 24 hours to let the nitrogen dissipate from your blood.
That whole slide is, I'm sorry to cut you off, but that whole slide, is that also just to prevent hypoxia?
So
or is there something worse that happens when you have excess nitrogen in your blood?
Yeah. Yeah, bends is really what they're trying to prevent. Which, when you have the excess nitrogen, and then it starts boiling off and stuff, it can get really uncomfortable and bad.
Oh yeah, that does sound awful. Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Yeah, it's a little bit different than hypoxia, but a little bit different effects, but it has to do, with more the nitrogen releasing from your body too quickly. You want it to release more slowly and controlled than just exiting very quickly. So
that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. So motion sickness. This can be pretty bad. We've talked about this a little bit, but especially when you're sitting in the backseat or in turbulent conditions, you could get motion sick much easier. So motion sickness is caused because your inner ear is not agreeing with what your eyes are seeing. So if you're looking inside the airplane a lot and the airplane's moving and you're not, your brain can't comprehend what's happening, it's really easy to get airsick. So there's a lot of remedies for this. Avoid turbulent conditions, short flights, getting fresh air, and focusing things outside the airplane. Also taking medication to help get rid of some of the motion sickness effects. So, and then finally, this is again one of those things you might not think about, but if you give blood, and you give 1 unit or 2 units, or you give the platelet donation or plasma, you should wait some amount of time before you go flying. So if you give 1 unit, the FAA says that you should wait 24 hours as long as you have no excess symptoms besides that. If you give 2 units, then you should wait 72 hours. And then if it's a plasma donation, you should have a 4-hour recovery period as long as you have no symptoms. So again, these aviation physiology stuff, I wouldn't worry about that too much right now. It's just kind of included in this section for risk management, but there's a whole nother section on aviation physiology. So yeah. Any questions though on that stuff?